Hi, sorry for the technical difficulties. My name is Bob Wiebold. I'm here with my wife, Marie. We're going to talk about aging in the garden today. Green Thumbs Never Die is our title. We were looking at the internet back in November or December, and we saw a program called Aging, Growing Old Aging with Grace. And we got the idea to try to put together a presentation on how one can continue gardening into their senior years. I'm 81 years old and I had my share of medical issues, but I'm gardening and I garden almost every day when the weather permits. I have been gardening since I was in elementary school in the third grade, I guess, in PS 100 in Queens. But every year I find myself doing a little bit less and doing things in different ways in order to accommodate my growing older and in fact larger. As the decades went by, I had to adapt my gardening and my gardening style to my body's limits. The basic program we're going to talk about today is why we garden as we age, why aging shouldn't prevent us from gardening, how aging limits our ability to garden, and how we can overcome these limits in terms of personal safety, the design of the garden itself, its structures, and its tools. We will then apply these tips to such gardening routines as planting, watering, weeding, and harvesting to give a picture of how this actually works, and then, of course, take any questions. Seniors should garden for many reasons. These are quickly physical health, mental health, social well-being, and essential dietary needs. An older body needs gardening because it provides flexibility of movement, prevents stiffness, coordinates hand, eye, and body in every single task. It involves stretching, bending, extending, reaching, walking, going to and from the garden, adds daily steps, moderate intensity daily activity, and vitamin D. There's no better source of that than the sun itself. Now, gardening also has mental health advantages. It sharpens and soothes minds. It provides sensory stimulation. You use all five senses: touch, taste, smell, and sight. So it's mindfulness in the moment with nature. It gives us a chance to be in a special relationship with the environment around us. It is also anti-boredom. We're always thinking and observing when we garden. And finally, we use our minds because we learn what, and the how of plants, of soil, and fauna. Now, gardening also can connect seniors. One of the most important things is loneliness and isolation in senior living, and everybody argues that we ought to do other things. Well, gardening can involve friends and family, fellow gardeners. There are garden clubs all over the Capital District, and community organizations. We do a lot of outreach work with library groups and other organizations, and it keeps us involved as senior citizens in our community, and that's a good thing. Now, as far as the diet itself, there's nothing better than freshness from your yard to your tummy in the same afternoon. Variety. Supermarkets don't sell as many varieties as seed and nursery sources. You rarely see more than one kind of carrot, or 2 or 3 kinds of onion. Peppers, they have a lot of, but other things like celery, how many times do you see more than one kind of celery in a supermarket? And then wholesomeness. In your own garden, you can control the fertilizer, the insecticides, the herbicides, and the purity of your food. There also contributes to microbiome diversity, glycophosphate, gut flora, all things that your body needs to process and digest foods. It also helps the economy, your economy personally, because you can grow your own rather than buying, which saves money and fights the inflation that many seniors on fixed incomes are dealing with. Now, we have limits as we age, and we have to address those for any gardening or any other activity for seniors. First of all, stamina, the desire and capability of workload. Too often, we're just more interested in sitting down or watching television than getting out there and doing it. And our stamina, once we start doing it, can lead to doing it for less time. So we have to be aware of that. Our strength, we can't lift as much as we could lift when we were younger. Flexibility, a little bit of arthritis creates hand and joint limitation. Bending, lower back pain. Balance, the risk of falling over when you extend. Lifting, it hurts your lower back, your shoulder, and puts stress on your arms. Kneeling puts joint stress and bone stress. Squatting puts stress on the knees, leg muscles, and lower back. Rising, getting up, is often the most difficult thing to do when you're down on the ground. And exposure, sun and heat, being outdoors puts you in that exposure situation for as long as you're out there. And finally, the vulnerability to medical emergencies while you're doing physical activity outdoors. So gardening and habits must adapt to the limits of seniors. First of all, we have to talk about safety, warm-up clothing, shoes, skin protection. Then layouts, the access and travel surfaces that we're going to cross and beyond as we garden. And finally, structures, beds, tables, containers, trellises, and seating that can help alleviate the stress of gardening. And ultimately, the tools themselves. We can go for ergonomic, lightweight, size to reach our beds. We have the ability to select plants that are low maintenance and use perennials rather than annuals. Routines, planting, weeding, watering, and harvesting, all can be adapted to the seniors' limits. We'll talk about that later. Planning and scheduling, planning ahead to minimize time and avoid gaps in garden maintenance. If you want to go out in the garden on a day and it starts to rain, it's fine, but you've got to reschedule for the rest of the week. Avoid gaps in garden maintenance. Weeds can grow very quickly. Plants can come to ripeness very quickly. So it's important to have a schedule that lets you get out and lets you adapt to conditions like weather. And finally, getting help. We can't do all the things alone that we used to do. So we'll talk about all of this. There's three basic rules, though, for any outdoor work. My father-in-law, 30 some odd years ago, was big on these three things. Work smarter, not harder. Use the right tools. Use mechanical tools when necessary. Never bend down at the hips. Always use some form of leg bending, knees. Use legs and not the back for lifting. These are basic things for almost any kind of work, and they're fundamental to many of the things we're going to talk about next. Beginning with the question of protecting yourself and safety, it's important to warm up before beginning with simple stretches. I have a simple stretch routine that takes maybe 2 minutes, and it allows me to make sure that my hamstrings, my quads, my shoulders, my hips are stretched enough so that I can begin doing things. The next good rule is to start with easy tasks. I go out in the garden, the first thing I do is I weed. I have raised beds and they're basically mulched. A few weeds will come up. It's a good way to get started. Trimming, things that need trimming, like your tomato plants or flowers or bushes, whatever you're doing, before you go into digging and carrying, which are harder and more stressful. Also apply sunscreen, lip balm, and bug repellent. The basic protections against the sun itself, sunburn on your lips and on your body, and bug repellent to avoid bites, particularly ticks these days. Dress in comfortable clothes. A broad-brimmed hat is very important. Sturdy shoes. Those are best over your ankle and with good treads. Gloves, something that can give you good grip, but also some water protection. Sleeve protection. I saw the other day when Marie bought me a pair of canvas arm things that just go over your basic arms when they're bare or with clothing, and they protect against any kind of thorns. And maybe an apron. to hold your tools in an easy, convenient place, your seed packs, notebooks, whatever. Finally, fill in a water bottle for hydration. Very important that when you're out, and particularly on a sunny day, you have an ample source of hydration. Carry snacks to replenish energy. Another good thing for all of us to be aware of is that we're going to be using fuel in our bodies as we work, and having a little replenishment gives us a chance to continue and operate effectively. Use cell phones, MediAlert, and partners in case of emergencies. Cell phone can be dialed to call 911 or a spouse or somebody indoors. Think about it. If you're out in the garden and somebody can't see you who's in the house, it could be a problem. You have a lot of MediAlert potentials these days, little alarm guys that send a radio signal and let people know you've got a problem. And finally, if you have a partner out there of some kind, a helper, think of the best thing to have in case of emergency. Pace yourself. We're not the ever-ready bunnies anymore. We have to use things like timers or sport watches to alert us on how to take a break and when to rest. Finger monitors can measure heart rate. So can some of the sports watches. I have a simple routine my cardiologist said was really good for me. I wait until my heartbeat goes above a certain number, usually about 100, and then I rest for a few minutes till it drops back down in the 70s, and I continue working. Have a place to sit in the shade or in and near the garden, and then finally be in the moment. You're really enjoying what you're doing, hopefully, and you can be mindful of the sensory inputs that a garden gives you between the pollinators, the flora, and the fauna. Now, a garden has to be accessible if it's going to be a senior garden. Paths to and within the garden should be free of obstruction. No rocks, irregular steps, or protruding vegetation. Now, many of us in the hillside situations have to be able to adjust the physical structure. And some of this has to be done in advance of the fact that you know you're going to be aging and being less agile than you will be at the current moment. A good example is my own. Marie and I have built a house with 7 levels, and we're both getting up there in years, and those stairs are beginning to be a problem. A ranch house would have been a fine idea 30 years ago. Also, we use a lot of wood chips for our pathways, but they're not as good as paving or gravel in terms of the ability to avoid tripping and wheeling anything in there or using wheeled chairs. They have to be sufficiently wide, your paths, for walking carts, for wheelchairs or wheelbarrows. If they're not, plan ahead a little bit at a time so that when you're up in your 60s and 70s and 80s, you're able to have these things available to you. Paths to and from the garden have to be free of clutter, railed if needed, or on a patio with containers. We should not ignore the fact that for many seniors, being out in a formal garden or a garden space is going to be a hard proposition. So let's use our patios. Let's use container gardening. Raised beds, raised planting areas. They minimize bending and stretching. Very important. The raised bed ideal height is about 30 inches, with the top being 12 to 18 inches of planting medium. Now this can be in a from the ground bed or a raised bed like we see on the slide. The ideal width is basically your reach while standing. Never more than 48 inches if it can be reachable from 2 sides, or from one side only, 24 inches. Elevate your planting area. Tables with trays or containers. Chairs as a base for totes or buckets. Planting troughs and raised flower pots. And wheelchair accessibility. These are all things that can be built into your planting area a little at a time, so it's ready for you when you're ready for it as a senior gardener. Container gardens work well for seniors. They're at a comfortable height, they're lightweight, they're portable, particularly those cloth bags. Pick them up with 2 handles, move them around. They're also nice little dollies that can move large flower pots, follow the sun on a patio, that sort of thing. And you need good drainage, and you can get it from container gardening, and they can retain water if you set it up with a nice tray underneath, and you're aware of the fact that container gardening probably needs more watering and methods of holding the water than would be in a garden, like a formal garden bed or the soil itself. Vertical gardens. This is a very important thing to avoid the bending. Um, Trellises and vines, tripods, even ladders, as shown in the photographs. Vertical planters. There's a whole set of those out in the market now in the last few years that offer ways of stacking flower pots and planting containers in a basic, V pattern so that you can reach them at all levels. These are excellent for tomatoes, for gourds, for fruits, for melons, for grapes. Now, seniors can adapt their tools to the physical limitations. In all phases of gardening, the tools themselves, the use of carts, hoses, and even your sitting options. Try pool noodles for padding on tools. One of the problems with any kind of aging is that your grip tends to be weaker, and maybe you can't make a fist like you used to be able to. Pool needles put as padding on tools widen the grip. It's a very simple, inexpensive way. Most of them have a slit. They have different widths. Cut to length, slice on one side. It works on long tools and short handle tools. Try it on wheelbarrows, buckets, even hand mowers and garden cart handles. How about metal handrails? Hand tools, select them to match your limits. Get ones that are lighter weight, longer handles, wider grips, and things that are, and this is important, visible against the green garden. You really want to be able to find your things and do it in a simple and easy way, and nothing is better than colored tool handles. Carts and barrows. The old traditional wheelbarrow with the 8-inch wheel is not as effective as large wheel, bicycle wheel type carts. So larger wheels, lighter weight, and a tool cart to carry your tools. All of these things help make your job easier and less stressful. And avoid heavy rubber hoses. There are many hoses out in the market today that are flexible composition. They're lightweight, they small diameter, they store easily, and the other possibility is to plan now for installation of irrigation systems with timers. That can eliminate the issue. So, knee wear and hip wear. Bending and working on your knees, which we could do when we were younger, is not necessarily easier. I've never seen so many people with knee replacements these days. Stools, adjustable, with sturdy legs, armrests, non-slip legs, and back support are very good. Stool cushions, knee pads, and mats are available in a variety of types. And finally, you can have wheeled garden seats where you can just sit and scoot around. The other point is to select low maintenance plant varieties. Replace annuals in your garden with perennials. Perennials that don't need deadheading are better than those that do. Bushes that need a minimum of pruning. Mulch and ground covers can minimize weeding. And easy to grow and harvest vegetables like radishes, brassicas, herbs, salad greens, and vine crops are ways to go. You can also schedule yourself when you garden to make it easier. Early AM avoids overheating better and is better for watering. Shady days avoid sun impacts. Shorter sessions avoid fatigue. And fewer days per week in the summer avoids heat stress. Now, you've got to know the signs and symptoms of heat stress. In a quick review: dizziness, headache, weakness, rapid heartbeat, nausea, cramps, chest pain, and labored breathing. You can wear loose, breathable clothing if you work in the sun. Remember, we talked about hats and sunscreens. Proper hydration is important. Have some liquid with you. And when weather is bad, is hot, avoid caffeine, cool down whenever possible, and try to stay out of the sun as much as you can. Don't go it alone. Some garden tasks cannot be done anymore by yourself. So you got to recruit family, friends, or neighbors. My son sort of comes over to visit, and you always put him to work. I think he's catching on. So he comes on rainy days. Hire the young and strong. A lot of kids out there are looking for physical training these days. High school football player, coach, that type of stuff. You can try to find them. We've seen some ads recently in our local internet sources that basically are looking for that. It's paid, but it's useful to do the heavy work for you. Companionship and conversation. It's good to garden with a friend or a family member. One thing about a 30-inch bed, for example, it's great, not only for your bending and everything, but it's the perfect height for somebody in a wheelchair to put. It's also the perfect height for a grandkid. Kids are very good at working 24 to 30 inches above the ground. And in emergencies, a companion may be absolutely essential. Now, how do these tips apply to garden routines? We're going to talk about planting, watering, weeding, and harvesting to give you an example of how all this stuff plays together. The raised beds or containers will ease backstrain. Long-handled and ergonomic tools will ease digging. Stools to bring you closer to seeding and to transplanting. And larger wheels make soil and tool cutting easier. Watering. We talked about flexible hosing that make watering less wearing and store easily. A timed irrigation system eliminates the chore completely. And what can be easier than that? Weeding can be easier with longer handles. Ground covers and mulch reduce weeding. Stools, pads, and movable sitting ease the weeding task also. Harvesting. Plant selection, vertical systems, and trellising allow harvesting while standing. This can be done in a raised bed with tomatoes, any vine crops, between melons, everything basically that can be put on a vine can be trellised and lifted up, so all you have to do is reach for it. In summary, keep on keeping on. The joy of growing and sharing the experience can safely be with you for all your days if you're prepared, if you plan ahead, if you adapt your tools, equipment, and plants to your physical limits, and you organize your growing areas to fit your fatigue. You can time your gardening to fit your stamina and the weather, and always remember to get help when you need it. That concludes our presentation. So if you have any questions, let us know, and we thank you for the opportunity to present.
Okay.
Well, thank you, guys. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad that fixed itself. So I'm glad we got through the little technical difficulties, and we're very happy to have you here today, and thank you for a wonderful program. We're going to look in the chat and see. I know we have a couple questions here, or at least one question. And I'll mention to everyone else, if you have questions, you can type them in the chat box at this point. And maybe Marie and Bob can elaborate on some of the points they made. I think they gave us a lot of good things to think about, and maybe get us started thinking in this direction. So the one question here is, please explain further your slide about the microbiome and glycophosphate.
Well, basically, there's a whole series of research leading to dietary recommendations based on gut bacteria and the importance of gut bacteria in everyone's health, but particularly in seniors. And in effect, being able to have a wide variety of vegetables that can produce a variety of basically bacteria in your digestive system is extremely valuable thing.
Another question. I haven't seen a long-handled trowel. Where can you get something like that?
First place to go is A.M. Leonard or Gardener Supply. They have 18 and 24-inch travel options, which I think are very useful. I find I'm a little happier with about an 18-inch reach than a small trowel.
Okay, I know both of those are online, and A.M. Leonard is one that maybe people wouldn't be so familiar with that one. A.M. Leonard is a company that will sell a lot of equipment to professional people, but they also have catalogs and homeowners, gardeners can buy from them as well, and they have a lot of interesting stuff. And Gardener Supply is, of course, pretty famous. I think a lot of people get that catalog. Okay, does anybody else have any other questions? I was thinking about shrubs that you didn't need to prune so much.
I have been, instead of getting a lot of the higher shrubs, your hydrangeas and some of the regalia. I've been looking at many of the dwarf ones, which only get to be about 3 or 4 feet high. Much easier for me to prune, to keep in shape, rather than struggling trying to reach the top of a lot of my higher shrubs. Rhododendrons now are way over my head. So I've been looking of late for more of the dwarf varieties. And I know Proven Winners is been really expanding that line. So I'm experimenting and expanding that line around the house along with them.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking about proven winners, I think they are trying to provide more compact plants
Yes.
and smaller growing plants. Part of that issue too is that a lot of new home construction features yards and gardens that are much smaller than a lot of the older houses have. I mean, I have 1.3 acres. It's like a farm. And I have space for, redwood trees, but a lot of the newer developments have very narrow planting beds and smaller areas. So the nursery industry is trying to provide more compact plants and smaller plants. So that's good for the seniors too. I hadn't really thought about it in that way, but that kind of works together.
Yes. Yep.
How about suggestions on containers for a patio or a cement patio? What kind of containers could we have there?
I think the key thing is something that's been raised up. Now, most of the garden supply companies will sell trugs, that they call them, on legs that can be put out on a concrete patio. The question is drainage and how you handle that. And normally you need some kind of a tray setup. We had a picture in our slide presentation of using a dollar store container with holes in the bottom and put it on a chair. There was one woman who actually had a garden that must have had, I don't know, 100 or more square feet, basically in these containers, put them on little plastic chairs. The container might cost $6 and the chair 8. But you can buy 10 of those and have a garden on any kind of surface, even along a driveway or side of a house. Looks a little odd, but it certainly works, gives you plenty of planting space. Key thing is to make sure whatever you use drains well.
Also, we were at the Chatham Agway over the weekend, and they now have local lumber trucks on that are about, I want to say, probably 30 inches or so high. And extremely reasonable in price. I think it was around $100. Which for many seniors or people that just have a small patio, that's an economical way to get going. And I think the size was something like a 2-inch or a 2-foot by 4-foot. Great way to get something going and maybe just scale down from what you used to have in your big garden.
Yeah, I think that's a good point is, you know, you can't be maybe having as much as you had before, but have the things that you like the best, right? Grow only the vegetables you really enjoy the most.
Right, or having spices close to your kitchen. It's a good way to, save.
It's very important, though, for any kind of patio garden to follow the sun and be able to move. That can be done with a lot of these little round dollies that have a couple of wheels to put a large flower pot. We also use those fabric bags because they both have handles and you can move it. Because we recently gave a presentation at a senior complex where everybody's patio would be the only place they could plant, and they were facing different directions sunwise. So the question of being able to move it around is very important.
Right. Or if you don't have a lot of sun, maybe you have to grow shade plants.
Coleus is wonderful.
Coleus, impatiens. Yeah, some of those things do okay in the shade.
And even vegetables will do well in the shade. They'll grow a little smaller and a little slower, but there are quite a few vegetables you can grow in a sunny shade format.
Yeah, the leafy vegetables grow the best in the shade, right?
Yep, any lettuces, spinach, kale particularly. You're not going to get as big a plant, but they'll grow and they'll grow well. And as long as you're harvesting leaves and not whole heads, you have a supply that will last quite a long time.
Okay, here's another question. I have seen stirrup hose recommended for weeding. Do you have any experience with that tool?
I'm not sure what a stirrup hoe is.
It's almost like it's a rounded part. It's almost like our skidger.
Oh yeah, we have, well, things like the skidgers and scuttle hose are very, very good for weeding. But not necessarily necessary if you're using a raised bed. Frankly, if you're mulching, you're getting rid of most of your weeds. And if you're reaching down and you pick them up a few at a time, particularly dandelions, I go around with a trowel, I get a dandelion sticking up through the mulch, I just dig it out and go find, get the whole root and get it early rather than when it goes to a flower and then finally to a seed pod. I think it's important to prevent the weeding, to limit the amount of weeding. People use all sort of fabrics and things like that, but I think natural mulch is probably the best.
And natural mulch that we use a lot is our lawn clippings. We don't use any of the fertilizers or anything. It's just a natural country lawn. But I bag everything when I do the mowing, and then we use all the grass clippings and all the leaf clippings that I pick up with the mower. We use that in our vegetable garden for mulching. So it's almost feeding organics as we're mulching every year.
Yeah, when you think about a mixture of uncontaminated grass and leaves, you've got a perfect base for compost. And it also makes an excellent mulch. So you put down 2 to 3 inches of that, and in the next season, you just dig through it. It'll eventually become part of the planting medium itself in a very nice way. It's got the greens and the browns that you'd like to see in a compost pile.
We haven't pruned our rhododendron. How or why do you do that? Just to keep them smaller?
No, I think you want to make your blossoms as large as possible. And the way a rhododendron grows, the minute it blossoms, if you take a good look at the blossom itself, take it off, and you'll find 3 or 4 buds usually forming right around where the flower was. That has to be pruned right after blossoming, because if you don't, each of those little buds is going to become a little branch. And eventually it fills out to a point where your flowers become much smaller. So the time to prune rhododendrons is right after blooming. You see those little buds out there, take off all but one, and then you'll have a much better crop of, I guess you call it a crop, harvest of flowers the next time around.
There were a question about, I think Marie said a trug, and they were wondering what a trug or a truck was.
A trug is basically a TRUG. It basically is a planting box which usually has a lining. It can be various sizes. It basically sits on 4 legs and is held off the ground about 30 inches. It's sort of a V shape usually, if you look at it from the ends. And basically it works as it's like a planting box, but it's not rectangular.
Yeah, it was almost like one of the square ones I showed earlier in the presentation. Hold on.
Well, that's something we can do some research on at Krug, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah,
It's basically that raised flower bed on 4 legs.
it's funny because different people use that word differently. A trug to me is like a basket. That's what they
Yeah.
would call it in England to carry something.
Right.
But I
Some,
think I think that word is used in a variety of ways.
yeah, it can be a
Agreed.
permanent thing or a carrier. Usually it's the same shape though. Usually it has
Yeah,
slides. So it could be a basket. It could be, I've seen it used in the case of those little carts, the receptacle that holds your waste when you tootle around doing your gardening is sometimes called a truck. And it's something you can pick up and move around and dump. So it's got many multiple meanings, I think.
that's a good word for a crossword puzzle.
Oh, yes.
DRUG, trug. One other question here. Do you mulch your containers?
Yes,
The answer is yes.
yes.
And the best mulches there are some of the mosses, something a little thinner, but finer. We would use very well chopped up leaves, for example, as a good mulch. You can use basically straw, but cut it small. The idea of a container is it's more vulnerable than any kind of a bed or the ground itself in terms of losing moisture. So some kind of a mulching makes a lot of sense there. It also, as you get sort of settlement, it also adds, and it can be stirred in subsequent years plantings. So mulch is highly recommended, probably less than an inch, just enough to stop weed growing and to hold moisture.
Okay. Well, if anybody else has any other questions, we can take one or two more before we go. I just want to say this was a program that really kind of gets you thinking. I think maybe that's our main purpose today is to get people thinking about maybe making some changes. I probably want to go out on a limb and say it's probably better to make some changes before you have to rather than after you're really not doing so well. And you say, why? I wish I had done X, Y, and Z to set myself up for the next 5 years of gardening, right? You guys said something about we have a house of 7 levels and maybe we should live in a ranch house. And I think a lot of people are thinking that same thing when they get to be retired. And maybe it's a little bit better to be a little proactive before you have to be.
It's very important for several reasons. When you're looking ahead and you're saying to yourself, well, today I can do this, but in 20 years, can I still do it? That's the basic question. It comes into play, particularly when you're doing a stepped structure of any kind. For example, on a hillside, you may be able to bound from rock to rock, or level to level, but you may not be able to do that. You may need a more formal path with a railing, thinking ahead a little bit. But if you put that in, as you say earlier, it's better. Same thing with beds. Some of my beds are basically only 18 or 24 inches apart. Fine for slipping in and walking. Wouldn't know what to do if I was in a wheelchair. So the idea is to try to build that in as you go. Put your beds a good 30 inches apart or at least 2 feet. But for a wheelchair, I think 30, 36 is needed. You know to know when it's going to hit you. And also might just be an accident or something like a hip replacement that you'd be using your wheelchair only for a little time. But if you want to keep gardening, it's good to plan ahead for it. Make sure your paths are there.
Yeah, it's always a good idea to plan ahead, right? Some of us are better at that than others.
It also spreads the cost, which is important. You do a little in the next 5 years, you're not going to experience the cost when you're retired and don't really want to spend the money.
Right, right. And if you slowly adapt towards it, then you get better at your container gardening as you maybe phase out the big vegetable garden in the ground and you don't have to do it all in one year. You kind of slowly move in that direction. I think you know, if I'm thinking right, that's what I'll be doing. So,
The other thing to think about on container gardening is it's a good skill to develop early, because a lot of senior folks live in condominiums and homeowners association situations and apartments with rules. So you may be very limited in what you can do. So it's important to be able to do container gardening in a way that fits the circumstances you're in.
right, right.
Don't let you go in front of your unit and dig anything up. You may have to stay with their landscaping, so all you have is a patio. So becoming more and more of a problem as communal housing becomes more and more prevalent for seniors.
Well, and then you get to the people that plant tomato plants in other people's yards and do guerrilla gardening, right? When people aren't looking.
The other thing that seniors can think about, and we were in a project the other day that had a community garden with about 40 individual 4x4 plots for the residents. They had a lot of questions, but the garden was laid out in a way that almost everybody at any age level could work in. And but with all the strict rules as to what you can do and how you have to clean it up and things along those lines. And the beds weren't high enough. You know, they were only 12 inches off the ground. But the whole big idea is that communal gardening in a residential setting like that can be very important. But again, ask the people that are in charge of it to think ahead about accessibility.
One last question. Do you guys have any special advice for dealing with deer, rabbits, and chipmunks in the containers?
Oh, my perennial garden and my shrubs and most of that, I actually do a deer out propels all, you know, one of those sprays, and I'm very perpetual about spraying. It's on my calendar to do every month, and then I have beautiful tulips, and I have all the plants that I really want to have come to flower. Our vegetable garden, however, is fenced. We're in the process of building a forest garden, food forest garden. And I'm not quite sure how we're going to be able to, haven't thought right yet about complete fencing, or we'll just see how it goes and see how the first year or two go for the food forest.
One point on beds is if you're going to build a bed for the first time, put hardware cloth or some kind of wire barrier under it. Very important, because chipmunks can come from the bottom.
Absolutely.
So that's a very important rule. The other thing is that if you're planting in the ground, you can plant bulbs, for example, wrapped in chicken wire. This is something that most of the small gnawing animals don't like, because the chicken wire cuts their lips. So we, for example, planted tulips, which were put into a chicken wire basket, about an inch, you know, high. The bulbs were all set in it. We put it in, covered it with a few inches of soil and a little bit of mulch. The tulips came up great. The bulbs weren't eaten. Then the deer came along and got the tulips. But you know, it's a question of which animal you're dealing with. But little things like voles and groundhogs and stuff like that can be kept out only by basically effective fencing. Now, in containers, when you raise them off the ground, you're halfway home in protection, and maybe some kind of little decorative fence that raises them up even more. A deer can eat almost anything at a 30-inch level we were talking about. So it's sort of interesting to have a barrier, you know, that's a little bit taller than that isn't unsightly. You know, maybe a little picket fence kind of thing with small slats, just to get it high enough so the deer really don't get over it. But most of the ground animals will not come up like 4x4 legs to get at the box itself. So your real danger there is only something that's tall, a ruminant. We actually had a cow come in and eat some of our vegetables from a neighboring property. We sit on the porch having a cocktail, and we're looking out, and this cow coming along, stops in Marie's garden and starts mulching away.
How tall is your deer fence?
Deal fence, well,
6
it's
foot.
6 foot, and it seems to work. I've heard people say that you have to be at least 8 feet so deer can jump over it.
Yeah, 6 foot has been
But
working fine.
6 foot's fine, even 4 foot if it's in a raised area, because the deer doesn't like to go uphill on that kind of a thing. So if you had like a 1 foot slope, and then a 4 or 5 foot fence, you might be okay. But basically 6 feet seems to work against deer. Problem is, unless you're using a very fine mesh fencing at the ground level, it doesn't really stop small animals from getting in. The only technique I've seen there is to, let's say you get chicken wired on a 2 foot wide width and you put it around your garden. You bend it in the middle, so you're going up a foot and you've got a foot along the outside of the your fence. You can put stone on top of that. The combination of the stone and the chicken wire also prevents digging under it. So that's effective to some extent. But things like raccoons and all can get right through it. They'll climb up a fence and over and down. Nothing much you can do. Good story. On that, I planted 40 corn plants at one point. I had over 100 ears of corn growing on them, and I decided to wait about 4 or 5 days till they got really ripe. Everything was looking great. Came out one morning and I had cobs. Every single ear of corn was peeled down, the greens was hanging down, and the cob was sitting there and no kernels. I was so mad, I couldn't believe it. But it had to be a raccoon or something along those lines to do that.
Oh, I've had that happen too. I certainly understand. So, well, I want to say thank you to you, Bob and Marie, for your program today. It was a lot of fun. Again, it gave us a lot to think about.